My brother, Leo, didn't leave a suicide note. He was too disciplined for that. He didn't want to leave a mess of emotions for the housekeepers to scrub away. Instead, he left a copper key. It was taped to the bottom of a half-empty bottle of 30-year-old scotch, hidden in the back of his mahogany closet, resting right beneath a pair of varsity cleats he hadn't worn in years. To the rest of the world, Leo was the golden boy of Oakhaven. He was the son who made our father, the Honorable Judge Thorne, look like a king. Leo was a straight-A student, a star athlete, and possessed a smile that seemed to promise the world was a safe, predictable place. But I knew the truth. I had spent 24 years watching that smile crack. I saw the way his fingers would drum against his leg in a frantic Morse code rhythm whenever our father entered the room. I saw the way he stared at the woods behind our estate, not with the curiosity of a boy, but with the hollow eyes of a man watching his own grave being dug. When the funeral happened, the town of Oakhaven stopped breathing. It was the biggest event of the decade. People lined the streets in black wool coats, clutching umbrellas against a sky that looked like a bruised lung. My father stood at the pulpit, delivering a eulogy that felt more like a closing argument than a goodbye. He talked about legacy. He talked about the Thorne standard. He didn't talk about his son. He talked about a monument. And as I sat in the front row, feeling the copper key burning a hole through my lace glove, I looked at my mother, Grace. She was draped in a black veil so thick I couldn't see her eyes, but I could hear her. It was a soft, rhythmic clinking. Every time she breathed, the small glass bottle of nerve tonic in her purse hit her wedding ring. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of a woman drowning in plain sight. For 3 weeks after we buried him, I became a ghost in my own home. My father went back to the courthouse, sentencing men to life in prison for crimes far less heinous than the one I suspected was rotting in our own foundation. My mother stayed in the sunroom, staring at the oak trees, her skin turning the color of old parchment. I tried that copper key on every lock in the house. I tried it on the Victorian grandfather clock. I tried it on the padlocks of the horse stables. I even tried it on the small jewelry box my grandmother had left me. Nothing. The key was ancient, its edges worn smooth by the sweat of my brother's palms. He had carried this secret until it killed him. It wasn't until a rainy Tuesday afternoon that I remembered the blind spot. That's what Leo used to call the dense cluster of oak and bramble at the very edge of our property line. Our father had spent our entire childhoods telling us the woods were dangerous. Sinkholes, he'd say, his voice booming with authority. Rotten ground and old wells. If I catch you out there, you'll spend a month in the library. I pushed through the thorns, the rain soaking through my silk blouse, until I found it. It was a mound of earth and dead leaves, rectangular and deliberate. I kicked away the mulch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and found it. A stone hatch half sunken into the mud, secured by a heavy, rusted padlock. The copper key slid in. It didn't just turn, it surrendered. The sound of the lock clicking open felt like a bone snapping. As I pulled back the stone lid, a rush of stagnant, freezing air hit me. It didn't smell like a cellar, it smelled like a memory that had been left to rot. I climbed down the rusted iron rungs, my flashlight beam cutting through a darkness so thick it felt like velvet. I expected to find my father's black files, the illegal payoffs and the dirty secrets of a judge's career, but when the light hit the floor, I stopped breathing. It was a nursery, a perfectly preserved child's bedroom from the late 90s. Glow-in-the-dark stars were still stuck to the stone ceiling, their faint, ghostly green glow looking like radioactive eyes. There was a twin bed with a blue quilt, a stack of choose-your-own-adventure books on the nightstand, and a red fire truck sitting in the center of the floor, perfectly clean. But I don't have another brother. It's always been just Leo and me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the old springs groaning under me like a dying animal. I reached under the pillow and found a shoebox. Inside were hundreds of Polaroids. A boy with a gap-toothed smile, a boy playing with a red fire truck. A boy who looked so much like Leo it made my stomach turn. I reached the bottom and found the paper that changed my life, a birth certificate for Samson Thorne, born 2 years before Leo. I didn't hear the hatch close. I only realized I wasn't alone when I heard the rhythmic clink of glass against a ring. My mother was standing at the bottom of the ladder. She didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. She walked over and sat next to me on that blue quilt, the scent of gin and grief radiating off her in waves. She took the Polaroid of the gap-toothed boy from my hand and whispered, "He was so much louder than Leo. He used to run through the halls until your father's head would ache. He didn't know how to be a Thorne. He only knew how to be a boy." She told me the story then, the 8,000-word history of a family built on a graveyard. 26 years ago, before we moved to Oakhaven, my father was a young, starving prosecutor. He had the ambition of a king and the bank account of a beggar. One night, after a celebration for a major conviction, he drove home with too much whiskey in his blood and too much pride in his heart. There was an accident, a slick road, a sharp turn, and a child who wasn't buckled in. Samson didn't survive. My father knew that a DUI manslaughter charge wouldn't just send him to prison, it would erase the Thorne future he had spent his life dreaming of. So he didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. He sat in the mud with his dead son and calculated the cost of his soul. He decided it was worth the price. He built this cellar in the middle of the night. He told my mother that if she ever spoke a word, he would make sure she was committed to an asylum and she'd never see another child again. They moved to Oakhaven a month later, changed their names, and when Leo was born, my father decided he would simply try again. But you can't replace a soul. Leo found the key when he was 12. He had been coming down here for 14 years. Every time my father demanded perfection, every time my father forced him to be the golden boy, Leo would come down here and sit in the dark with the brother he was never allowed to know. He was living for two people. He was carrying the weight of a dead boy and a living monster. My mother looked at me, her eyes clouded with 20 years of nerve tonic, and whispered, "I saw Samson every day in Leo's face. Your father didn't love Leo, Jade. He just loved the fact that Leo didn't die. He used your brother to balance a ledger that can never be settled." I felt a cold, sharp rage settle into my marrow. I left my mother there, sitting on that blue quilt, and I climbed out of the dark. I didn't go to the police, not yet. I went to the Honorable Judge Thorne's study. He was sitting there, reading a law journal, looking like the very definition of justice. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I just laid the copper key on his desk right next to his Judge of the Year trophy. He looked at it, he looked at me. He didn't look guilty, he looked inconvenienced. "It's been 26 years, Jade," his voice as smooth as polished marble. "The statute of limitations on the accident is long gone. Digging this up won't bring anyone back. It will only destroy your mother's comfort and your own inheritance. Think about the Thorne name." I looked at him, the man who had turned my brother into a ghost long before he actually died. I realized then that I wasn't just my father's daughter. I was Samson's sister, and the Thorne name wasn't something to protect. It was something to burn. I looked at that copper key lying on the mahogany desk, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a father. I saw a criminal who had spent 26 years sentencing men to cells smaller than the one he'd built for his own son. He didn't realize that he couldn't overrule the truth this time. My father stood up, adjusting his silk tie as if he were about to address a jury. He walked toward me, his voice dropping into that paternal, soothing tone he used whenever he wanted to manipulate me. He told me that he had done it for the family. He said that if he had gone to prison back then, I wouldn't have had the life I have now, the private schools, the horseback riding lessons, the safety of the Thorne name. "Safety?" I whispered, and the word felt like a shard of glass in my throat. "Leo is dead because of your safety. Samson is a pile of dust in a hole because of your safety. You didn't build a life for us, Dad. You built a shield for yourself." I didn't wait for his rebuttal. I turned and walked out of the study, the sound of his voice calling my name fading behind the heavy oak door. I went back to Leo's room. I needed to know if the key was the only thing he'd left me. I went to that shoebox again, the one I'd pulled from the nursery. I started tearing at the cardboard, feeling a frantic need to find a piece of my brother that wasn't a lie. and there, taped to the very bottom of the box, was a small, silver USB drive. I plugged it into my laptop, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hit the keys. It wasn't just a confession. Leo had been a scholar, a meticulous record keeper. He had spent the last 5 years of his life using our father's own legal access to track the black money. My father hadn't just covered up an accident, he had been taking bribes from the very corporate developers who were destroying the valley. He had used the disappearance of Samson as a way to launder the initial funds, claiming insurance on a life he'd already snuffed out. But the biggest blow was a video file. I clicked it. It was Leo, sitting in that dark nursery, the glow-in-the-dark stars reflecting in his eyes. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world and was finally ready to set it down. "Jade," his voice came through the speakers, soft and haunting. "If you're watching this, it means I've finally found my way back to Samson. I'm sorry I left you alone with him, but I couldn't be the golden boy anymore. Every time he looked at me and smiled, I felt like I was stealing the air from a dead boy's lungs. I need you to do what I was too afraid to do. Don't just expose him, destroy the firm. Give the money back to the families in the valley. Give Samson a name. And for God's sakes, Jade, tell Mom it wasn't her fault." The video ended, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I spent the next 48 hours in a trance of calculated destruction. I didn't go to the local police, my father owned them. I didn't go to the town's newspaper, my father sat on their board. I went to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the city. I sat in a cold, windowless room and handed them the shoebox, the USB drive, and the copper key. I told them about the night of the accident. I told them about the stone hatch in the woods. I told them about the man who wore a judge's robe by day and cleaned a ghost's room by night. When the feds arrived at the Thorne estate, it wasn't a quiet affair. They didn't come with a polite knock. They came with search warrants and backhoes. The town of Oakhaven watched in horror as the saint of justice was led out of his mansion in handcuffs. My father didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like an old, panicked animal, his silk shirt stained with sweat, as he shouted about illegal searches and due process. They tore up the woods. They opened the stone hatch in front of a dozen news cameras. When my mother finally broke, she didn't need nerve tonic anymore. She stood on the lawn, the black veil ripped from her face, and she screamed a name that Oakhaven had never heard. "Samson, my baby!" It was a sound that tore through the pretense of our perfect life. It was the sound of 26 years of repressed agony finally finding its way into the light. The trial was a circus. My father tried to argue that it was a mercy to keep the child close to home. He tried to claim that my mother was the one who insisted on the burial. But I stood on that witness stand, looking him dead in the eye, and played Leo's video. I let my brother's voice fill the courtroom, exposing the bribes, the insurance fraud, and the cold, calculated heart of the man who had traded his sons for a title. When the verdict was read, life without the possibility of parole, my father didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. He had finally lost the only thing he ever cared about, his reputation. My mother moved into a small house by the sea, far away from the shadows of Oakhaven. She doesn't drink gin anymore. She spends her days in a garden full of sunflowers, Samson's favorite. She still talks to them, but now she knows they're listening. And me? I used the last of the Thorne money to set up a foundation for children who have been erased by the system. I made sure every cent my father took in bribes went back to the families he'd crushed. I went back to the estate one last time before the bank seized it. The woods were quiet now. The stone hatch had been filled in with concrete, sealed forever. I walked to the local cemetery, to the new plot I'd bought. There are 2 headstones now, side by side. One for Leo, the boy who gave me the truth, and one for Samson, the boy who finally got to come home. I laid the copper key on the grass between them and sat there until the sun went down. The silence wasn't a threat anymore. It wasn't a secret. It was just peace. My brother didn't leave a note, but he left me a path. And as I walked away from the Thorne legacy, for the first time in 26 years, I realized I wasn't just Jade. I was free. "Good night, brothers," I whispered into the wind. "The cellar is finally empty."